Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We are so excited about bringing back our in-person events, beginning with an exclusive members-only tour of a new exhibit at the Skirball Center this July. We also have announced yesterday that we are providing our members with a free subscription to the Daily Chatter, which is an international newsletter written by top journalists around the world. So if you aren't a member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall, please consider joining by visiting our website. For those of you who would like to ask our distinguished panelists questions today, there is a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your question during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program. A Year of Reckoning, Assessing the State of Racism and Discrimination in America from COVID-19 to 2021. With panelist Michael Lawson, President and CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League. Helen Torres, the Executive Director of Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, or HOPE. Charlie Wu, who is Chair of the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, CAUSE. And our moderator, Professor Dan Schnur. Dan, it's great to have you moderating yet another program this week.
Oh, Kim, thanks so much for having us. And thanks to all of you. And thanks to all of you who are joining us for today's conversation. I know I get to see many of you each week for our weekly webinar, but I think you're going to find this conversation to be a particularly interesting and a particularly enriching one. And I want to join Helen in welcoming my friends Charlie Wu of CAUSE, Helen Torres of HOPE, and Michael Lawson of the LA Urban League, who is with us, and I think will be joining us on screen in just a moment. I think Michael, there you go, great. It's terrific to have all three of you with us here today. And before we get started with our conversation, I just want to provide our audience with just a little bit of background and guidance on how this remarkable coalition came together and the tremendous work that you've all been doing since teaming up. So in late 2019, Charlie and Helen and Michael began talking about a cross-community partnership. And I have to say that if any three organizations in the greater Los Angeles area were going to take on this effort, it would be and should be the Urban League and CAUSE and HOPE, because each one is, in my opinion, the most respected community organization representing each of these three racial and ethnic communities. And having Charlie and Helen and Michael, leaders like each of them within their own communities and in the broader Los Angeles landscape, involved in a singular project, I will tell you, is a recipe for success. The first project that this coalition took on was a joint polling project, the California Community Poll, which beginning last February, before the COVID shutdown, before the death of George Floyd, before the summer of protests and racial reckoning that we all experienced, this coalition began to survey Californians on questions relating to race relations and discrimination. Through the 2020 election season, through COVID, through George Floyd, through the protests, through an incredibly difficult and divisive election and post-election season, this coalition produced a series of public opinion polls done on a statewide basis here in California, but with a particular focus on the African American, the Latino, and the Asian Pacific communities in order to dig deeper into the attitudes and opinions of members of these communities to a much greater degree than most typical public opinion polls, do. The most recent of those surveys is something we released not too long ago, earlier this spring. And in addition to examining these ongoing topics of race relations and discrimination, this survey also looked into forwarded questions relating to COVID, to the vaccines, to the economic slowdown and now regeneration, to questions relating to school reopening and distance learning, and then beyond COVID, questions relating to hate crimes, to voting rights, to immigration, to police reform and public safety, as well as these broader topics of race relations and discrimination instead. And so Helen, Michael, Charlie, the three of you in your organizations really provide a tremendous public service. And on behalf of Angelenos and those of us living in Southern California who benefited from your leadership, I want to just not only welcome you, but thank you for all the good work you do. So with that explanation / introduction for all of you who are joining us today, I do want to get into a conversation and give Charlie and Michael and Helen a chance to talk not only about the poll results themselves, but more broadly about what they see happening in each of their communities and in all of ours. So Helen, I'm gonna start with you, and I'm gonna start with a very broad and perhaps somewhat unfair question. So we've been at this for over a year now. And so what I'd ask you to do, if you're willing, is to look back to where we are when we began this project last February. And do you think, by way of comparison, do you think that race relations here, do you think race relations today are better than they were when we began this project last winter? Do you think race relations are worse? Or do you think they're the same? Helen, what do you think?
Well, Dan, thank you so much for that question. It's a very nuanced question, but before I begin answering it, I also want to give some gratitude to you, Dan, for your leadership and being the glue that has brought us all together and your foresight in doing that. As you mentioned, when we started this journey together as a coalition in February of 2020, no one knew that COVID-19 was around the corner, literally around the corner, and that we would have such a summer of violence against so many communities of color, and an opportunity to uprise and have response to that violence. Where we are today, I think, is there is a larger coalition of individuals out there that says the status quo is not working. I don't know if that means that we're improving race relations. I think we're on that journey to do so. And we know this from our poll, where, you know, depending on how people were feeling about COVID-19, they put race relations either doing well or not so well in their local communities, but always had a lot of anguish and a lot of reserves when they talked about how race relations looked from a statewide perspective or even from a national perspective. And that has a lot to do with leadership. The other thing I would say is I'm always looking for those rays of optimism and hope, obviously running an organization that is built on this premise that we are going to achieve equity and equality for all. That one of the things that came from the poll that I thought was important was questions that we asked around immigration. And why I thought that was important is because immigration cuts across all races. And what we found was a vast majority, over 50%, 56% of Californians really saw that immigration was a net positive, especially around in economic ways. So that, to me, if you were to take this poll probably, you know, back 20 years ago, we could have made it an assumption that that wouldn't have been the case. So I think there's some opportunities to build upon. There's definitely still a long road ahead of us. And we know that change doesn't come easily. I think people are always looking to keep the status quo, but I think there's a larger group of us saying the status quo is just not good enough.
Helen, thank you so much. And many other questions I want to put to you before we open this up to our audience for their questions. But first, I want to make sure to bring Michael and Charlie into this conversation. So Michael, I'll turn to you next on behalf of our audience and ask you the same question I did Helen. Given the remarkable events of the last year and a half, if you take a step back for a broader perspective and to take the long view, are we in a better place now than we were when we started this? Have things gotten worse, or have things largely remained the same? What are your thoughts?
There's no question that things are better. And I say that unequivocally because I look at where we are through a lens of history. When you have you go back to 2008 and this country elects an African American as president of the United States, something that you would not have expected in 2004 or and it happens, and then we have the election of Trump winning the White House. And is that an indication of a switch or a change in race relations? No. It's really a function of how willing people are to express their positions, the ones that they talk about indoors. What we have seen recently is, well, let me specifically talk about January 6th. What you saw on January 6th was not something new, but people who were willing to speak the truth of what they truly believe. I think during the Obama administration and leading up to the Obama administration, the people that you saw in QAnon and so on and so forth, they have been there. They may have expanded some of their groups, but they have always been there. And what you saw was them becoming more vocal. So that issue has been there. That when you look at the violence against African Americans, the violence against Latinos, the violence against Asians over the decades, and you think about how much of this was actually reported, how much of this got into the paper, how much of this was focused on. I submit to you that things have gotten better in part because we are seeing it directly, that it is not being hidden. And because it is now out in the open, we can address it, we can attack it, and we can speak to people who are easily swayed by some of the rhetoric, by some of the posts on Facebook and other platforms where they hear this rhetoric and start to believe it and so on and so forth. Once you get it out in the open, now you can start addressing it. But make no mistake, what you are seeing now is not a worsening of the racial divide, but a clearer focus on the racial divide, which will allow us to address it more directly. So I am the word I'm looking for is energized, if you will, about what we can do in the conversations that we can now have. When you think about the fact that it's been 100 years since the massacre in Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, And now, 100 years later, you're hearing about what happened, and people are talking about what happened, and people are talking about the possibility of reparations and making amends for the devastation that occurred there. And as we've spoken before, this happened throughout the country during that period of time. We're having the conversation. Without the conversation, there can be no redemption. So I am hopeful that these conversations will continue. The racist activity that we see, I submit to you that what we're seeing is more, we're seeing a spotlight being put on it, as opposed to it happening, there being more of it. And so having the spotlight on it helps us deal with it more directly.
Well, I think that's a fascinating point, Michael, and it makes complete sense that having these types of sentiments visible and audible in the public square is unpleasant and it can be wrenching. But I hear you saying that it's necessary for progress. I think it's a fascinating point. I want to come back to you in just a little bit also, but Charlie, let me bring you into this conversation, because I know you've thought a lot about this question, not just as it relates specifically to the Asian Pacific community, but more broadly. Where would you assess, how would you assess our progress over the last year and a half on these questions of race relations and discrimination? Moving forward, moving backward, treading water, what do you think?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the thoughtful question. And I also want to thank World Affairs Council and Town Hall for putting this program on so that we can all share our observations and learn something from this. And actually, our polls have a specific question on that. If you look at strictly the race relations without digging deeper, the public, including many Asian Americans as well as others, would feel that the race relations are a little bit worse than what we were a little bit over a year ago. However, if you dig deeper into other related questions, you get a different picture. And there's reason why people are, not feeling too good about race relationship. And we have Helen mentioned a long summer of protests, and we see Black African Americans being murdered by police, and Asian Americans, because of the false accusation of being blamed for COVID-19, and Asian Americans are subject to unprecedented hated harassment and hate crimes. And let me just share with you some statistics. 73% of Asian Americans fear for their personal safety, fear that they become the victims of hate crime and physical violence. And 68%, more than 2/3, are really worried about being abused, harassed publicly. And of course, when we talk about hate crimes against Asians, there are a lot more verbal abuse and harassment than actual physical violence. But the physical violence is so serious in many cases that will result in death or very serious injuries. And so people are really fearful, not just because of the virus, but also because of the hate crime. And then Asian Americans feel like their lives are endangered in the last year. And that's the reason for, but because of that, I think Asian Americans are beginning to realize that we are not above racism. I mean, before COVID-19, about 63% of Asian Americans feel that, as a community, we are discriminated. And that's a significant lower number than Latino community recognize their own community being discriminated and African American. However, after COVID-19, after the whole year, the percentage goes to 80%. 80% of Asian Americans feel that we are being discriminated. We don't just feel that about ourselves. We also begin to recognize that African Americans are discriminated. Latino community has been discriminated. In a way, Asian Americans have woken up to the fact that racism does exist in this country. In fact, not only us, but others as well. So in that sense, I agree with Michael that the incidents actually bring us the recognition. When we cannot start solving the problem without recognizing the problem exists. I believe that kind of understanding, that kind of mutual understanding, bring us a lot closer together. By the way, the rest of California, whites, African Americans, and Latino, all have profoundly changed their opinion about racism against Asians. Because prior to this, we were the model minority. About a little bit more than half of Californians, believe that Asian Americans are subject to racism. But now, in a year's time, the number gone up to 70%. So that's slightly less than racism suffered by African Americans or Latinos, but they're in line. So Asian Americans struggle with racism and now being recognized almost at the same level. Actually, it's at the same level of African Americans or Latinos. By recognizing that and by recognizing ourselves, racism exists, I think that really builds the foundation of we are all in this together. We are in the same boat, and this is not an individual problem, a problem of any ethnic group, but America's problem. Is with that recognition that we can start working on the solutions. So in that sense, I feel very optimistic. This is a very important step.
Well, and of course, Charlie, this is the spirit behind the coalition, a recognition that any community that takes on these challenges alone faces a much, much greater challenge than those who are willing to do it collectively, the way you three in your organizations are. So I think your point is very well taken. As I mentioned at the outset, the most recent poll done this spring was very extensive and covered a very wide range of topics that we're not going to even hope to be able to cover before we bring Jessica back on to hear some of your questions in about 10-15 minutes. But I want to touch on just a couple of those questions, a couple of those topics before we go to our audience questions. But all of you made a broader point about attitudes, about race relations, but also about the ongoing presence of hate and the need to fight back against it. So, Michael, I'll come back to you on this question. What have we learned over our last year or so of research and communication about hate crimes committed against our communities?
I'm not sure that we've learned much more than that it still exists. A lot of emphasis has been put on the internet and the ability of people to kind of get into this wormhole of hearing only one voice and only going to sites that kind of pile on whatever discussion that they feel that that is supportive of the positions that they're holding. And so there's no real dialogue, there's no real discussion, there's no real pushback. And that is part of the problem. That is a significant part of the problem. And it is up to those of us who are willing to step up and say to friends, neighbors, whomever, that this is wrong. Because what you will find if you have an honest conversation with people that you enjoy being around, you will find that the system that we are in that perpetrates this echo chamber is having an effect. And if we don't engage with the people around us, that echo chamber will continue to reverberate and get louder and louder and louder. What we are seeing now, what we are hearing now, is a willingness of people to come out from their computers and actually say have these conversations with people other than what they see on their Facebook page. And that's important. And why I go down that road is that we need to be comfortable in saying, no, that's not right. No, that's not what I believe, because the people on this call, the people in the audience, like it or not, you're the thought leaders. Like it or not, you're the folks who have been willing to listen to opposing views and think about whether they're right or wrong, and are willing to accept that some portion of a position that someone else is taking may actually have some merit in some context, but we can't go down this road, or we can't go up this road, or so on and so forth. That conversation, that type of dialogue is what is needed. And I cannot say enough that the people who are in this audience, you are the respected members of the community. And people who are around you who harbor these thoughts will listen and pay attention to you. And that's really what is beginning to happen, this dialogue, this conversation. There are some people who just who are so deep in it that they're not going to change. And I'm not saying that we have an obligation to change everybody. But I am saying that we need to be open to having this conversation with others around us. I have seen this happen in conversations with people that I have known for years, who we get into a conversation and I'm hearing things from them that I didn't think I would hear. But by the end of the conversation, they're looking at the world from a different lens. And I say that not because I think that I can change the world. I'm just saying that every one of us has the ability to make these conversations more honest and forth and open. It's up to us, and we are here because we believe in this, in what the Constitution says, not in what this country has done. And we know that we can make this a better world. Absolutely. What you have done, Dan, with this with this system of conversations is critical to us moving forward through this. And I cannot tell you how much impact this has had on people around us, people around me, that harbored ideas and concerns that I didn't think they harbored until they came to me and said, I was moved by what you said. Maybe I didn't convince them completely, but they're willing to think about it. And that's what we did.
Well, thank you, Michael. And for the audience that might not have picked up on Michael's reference, in addition to the programs that we've had the privilege of doing with the LA World Affairs Council town hall like this one, on a monthly basis, Charlie and Helen and Michael, or representatives of their respective organizations, participate in a monthly program hosted by the LA Holocaust Museum. And I have the privilege of moderating that also. And each month we talk about a different topic in this broader scope of the discussion of race relations and discrimination, and talk about how best to move forward. Charlie, I know you in your first response touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to go into a little bit more detail about what you've seen over the course of this past year, particularly on the question of hate crimes, and what we've learned about those types of atrocities committed against all of our communities.
Yes, Dan, I do want to share a couple observations. First of all, I follow the hate crime, it seems the biggest motivation for perpetrator of hate crime against Asian American is that, Asian Americans are foreigners. They brought bad things to this country. The country would be better off getting rid of them and send them back home. And when we look at our survey, we ask about identities. 84% of Asian Americans consider the American identity, being American is very important to the identity. And by the same percentage, 5 out of 6, 84% feel that living in California being their home, is very important to their identity. No matter where, that sentiment applies to new immigrants or immigrants for here in generations. And for some people to tell us that we are not Americans, we should go back home when this is our home, that's really tragic for our community. But maybe one thing that we didn't make it clear is that Asian Americans also value the ethnic identity, ethnic heritage. We bring with us our cultural, our ethnicity, our heritage to this country, just as previous generation immigrants did. And although they faced resistance at the beginning, ultimately they all assimilated. And ever since the Chinese Exclusion Act 140 years ago, and we still face that challenge amongst some in America. So this is something that we really need to tell our story about Asian Americans contributed as part of the American history. And that's another thing that I want to share with is that as much as we went through the hate crime, and because of the outcry and because of the protests that we and the support from other groups, we achieved something that hasn't been achieved by any group in recent months, is that is bipartisan support, overwhelming support in Congress for anti-Asian hate crime bill. And this is probably one of the very few times that Congress come together in a bipartisan basis. So I think it teaches our community that we cannot be invisible. We have to make noise, and that actually worked. And I think the fact that we see some success, although having a legislation is not going to eliminate prejudice and bigotry, but it's a good first step. And I think that really motivates us to address other inequities, such as lack of representation in entertainment, in government, and in business. And I think this really is sort of a lesson for the community to learn that by working with other groups, we can make a difference. We can be visible. We cannot be silenced anymore. I think that's a very important lesson also.
I couldn't agree with you more, Charlie. And I think of all the really insightful points you made, the one that really stuck with me is that this is a multi-front challenge. It is about passing legislation, but it's also about changing hearts and minds. It's about convening conversations, not just within, but between communities. So there really are challenges on any number of different topics to take on this broader challenge, Helen. And so, Helen, I'd like to ask you if you'd be willing to address this question also, because I know you too have thought about what we may have learned over the last year plus about the menace of hate crimes, and in particular the increase that we've seen in recent months.
Well, I think one of the big learnings, and this is something that is in constant conversation, is that when it comes to hate crimes, there's definitely a gender lens to be applied here. Overwhelmingly, women, and we know this from our polling, feel more at fear of being a victim of a hate crime. And Latinas, compared to their counterparts, Latinos, and we're seeing a 20-point differentiation of reporting fear around hate crimes. We also know that our communities have an extreme concern when it comes to our children being bullied, feeling discrimination and racism in schools. So putting that all together, what do we do about it? I'm in agreement with Michael that having these conversations and having the data and knowing who feels the way they do helps us start coming up with solutions. But I think it's also important as we're having these conversations, and I loved Michael's lens on leadership, that we call out our leaders and ensure that they're in alignment with this larger vision of the United States being a place for opportunity for all. And I am extremely concerned at this time that we're not paying enough attention to how women are experiencing hate crimes, let alone really understanding the other layering, and I know we're going to speak to this, of COVID-19 and the impact it's had on women, specifically Latinas. So at times it feels like we're at a deficit, and I think we need to correct that as a society, especially as we continue having these dialogues. We need to understand the various ways that we're experiencing hate in this community, and how that's detrimental to the civic and economic fabric of the community that we're trying to build. So I wanted to put that forward. I think we need to understand the nuances of when we're talking about hate crime. We have a lot of different images of what that can look like, but I think there's something to be said about the hate crimes that our children are experiencing at school that may not be a result of violence, but of bullying. And words do matter, especially in this social media environment that we work on. So there's a lot of good, heavy lifting work that we have ahead of us.
Well, there is a lot. There's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of topics that unfortunately we're not even going to be able to talk about today. Research that's been done, as Helen mentioned, on COVID and vaccinations. Topics that we've discussed with our friends at the LA Holocaust Museum about police reform and public safety, about reopening the public schools. But what I do want to, before we bring Jessica on and turn to all of your questions, I do want to point out in particular something that Helen mentioned just in passing, because the real strength of an organization like HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, is it looks at these questions not solely through a lens of ethnic and racial heritage, but of gender as well. And I'd encourage all of you who are taking as much as I am from this conversation to go online and to look up HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, to look up CAUSE, Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment, to look up the LA Urban League and to learn more about the good work that Helen and Charlie and Michael and their colleagues are doing. If you have any trouble finding any of the three websites, just let Jessica and Claire and the team at the World Affairs Council Town Hall know, and they'll provide you with the links and the contact information. But as each of our panelists has said in slightly different ways, but coming back to the same central point, it's up to us to make a difference. It's up to us to make progress in confronting these tremendous challenges. So with that, I am going to ask Jessica to join us. And for those of you who follow my webinar, you know this is my favorite part of our programs, where I stop talking and we start going to your questions. And so Jessica, I imagine we've gotten quite a few from our audience today, given what we've heard from Charlie and Michael and Helen.
We have, and one of the first questions is where they can get a copy of this study that you guys have been discussing, or the poll. So is there a place where they might be able to access that study?
Sure, what we'll do, the poll was conducted by a phenomenal firm here in California called Strategies 360. And what we'll do, Jessica, if it's okay with you, is I'll provide you and Claire with that link. And then if anyone's interested in looking into the results in more detail, if you'd be in a position to provide it, that would be very helpful. But for those of you who don't want to wait for us, if you Google Strategies 360 polling, you ought to be able to find the company and find the results and some analysis as well.
Perfect. We send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with a link to the YouTube video of this discussion, and we'll make sure to include a link to that study once Dan provides that. So make sure to check your emails for those, and we'll get that to you. The first question, is there a big difference between young and those older in the various racial groups on their impression of how relations are improving or not?
Charlie, I know you've spent a good amount of time looking into that. Did you want to talk at all about the generational gap we've seen in our results?
Yes, I think there is a generation gap, and the younger people in Asian, in all community, feel a little bit about, in terms of being optimistic about America, they're less optimistic about the older generation. And then when it comes to discrimination, the younger people feel a little bit more sensitive to discrimination. Let me give you an example, right? We do have a question about how did the recent racism impact your mental health? And I was looking for Asian Americans when we asked that question, how the hate incidents, hate crimes impact Asian Americans. About 30% on the average of Asian Americans feel they're impacted. However, for the younger people, it's like 36%. When I look at the African Americans and Latino community, and actually the impact on mental health is a lot more serious on the African American community. And from the older and younger generation, it's almost a 2-to-1. The younger generation feel that their mental health is severely impacted because of that a lot more often than the older generation. So in a way, this country always hope that the next generation will do better. In many ways, the younger generation are less optimistic about, about the future and the race relationship, which is kind of it's something that we need to really look out for.
Thank you, Charlie. I know we've got a lot of questions, so Michael or Helen, if you'd like to weigh in on generational topics, you can. If not, we'll go on to our next questions, but completely up to you.
Very quickly, I would say I agree with everything that Charlie said. In the African American community, I would note that what you're seeing in our younger generation is a panoply of African Americans who are in very significant positions. I mean, you start with President Obama as a symbol of the heights that anyone can achieve. And so to the extent that they are seeing things in a slightly more negative light than the older generation, it's in part because their vision is so much larger than ours was when we were their age. And so they're seeing, well, there's not that many CEOs of Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. For my generation, the numbers that are there, 2 or 3, are enormously larger than they were when I was their age. And they're saying, oh, there's not enough. And I applaud them for saying it's not enough and pushing for that goal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Jessica, I know we have a lot of questions, but I will say this. Helen and her colleagues at Hope run such a phenomenal program for young leaders. It's a program called HLI, Hispanas Leadership Institute. And so before we go on, I'm wondering if Helen would like to offer her thoughts on the importance of investing in the next generation of leadership.
Thank you, Dan, for that. For us, it's all about the numbers and the belief in the democracy of the United States. And we come from it in a way of, if we want to see a continued democracy really reigning big in the United States and doing well and fulfilling our better union, we need to ensure our young leaders are ready to take on that mantle and that purpose. And that's what the Hope Leadership Institute is designed to do, is to ensure that Latinas are well equipped with the skills, but also understand that it is a responsibility as we grow to be the largest group here in California, and we're the second largest minority group in the United States, that we have an investment in this democracy. And that means that all of us need to step up and make sure that we're involved, that we're voting, and that our voices are being heard. We cannot take anything for granted, and we cannot assume that those platforms are going to be made available for us. So we need to be educated, prepared, and ready to ensure a strong United States moving forward.
Okay. And I should say that there are equally impressive young leadership programs being run out of Cause and out of the Urban League also. But Jessica, I know you got a lot of questions left, so I'm going to have to tell Charlie and Michael we'll have to rely on our audiences searching on their websites to learn more about those programs.
Next question, she says, directed to any or all of the speakers. Maybe I'm wrong, but I believe Americans have become more tolerant of other ethnic groups over the past 20 years. Couldn't the stress and anxiety caused by the pandemic be a source for some of the heightened racial tensions over the past year and a half, and that those manifestations of that are from a small minority of Americans?
Good. Michael, do you want to take a shot at that one? Are we talking about a very small number of people whose passions have been inflamed, given the pressures and the stresses of COVID?
I don't believe that's the case at all. What I would use as just an example is when we looked at the murder of George Floyd, and we looked behind that, and you looked at the history of the officer who murdered him, and the 18 prior incidences that were in his record, and the fact that nothing had been done, the fact that none of those had reached the level of just the protests were not about the 18, it was about the 19. Those things happened in silence. Those things happened because his fellow officers did nothing. Those things happened because the people that his superiors did nothing. That the legal system did not do anything to remove him from this position until not only did he murder George Floyd, but it was captured on video. And so the question is not so much what we're seeing, but what we haven't seen over the past few years that is finally coming into the light. It is uncomfortable, but it is that level of discomfort that we have to feel in order to make the changes necessary. Yes, what you're seeing and what you're hearing has been happening in the dark, and now that it's in the light, we can address it.
Thank you. What was the most shocking result you found from your most recent poll?
Boy, who would like to take a shot at that? I see all three of you smiling, which means you were all shocked by something or other. Helen, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'll do it quickly so my other colleagues and peers can also chime in. I don't know if the shocking is the word for it, but the one that I was most happy to discover was, especially among the Latino community, how many individuals were either vaccinated or ready to be vaccinated. And the hesitancy was a small group, less than 20%, who said that they were hesitant about the vaccine. But I really feel that my optimism is that with the right targeting and the right communications and making the vaccine available either through an employer or in their communities, that we can even sway those 22%. So I don't know if shocking is the right term, but I was very optimistic about that. The other one I would say, and I mentioned this before, there were so many questions around immigration, and overwhelmingly there was a lot of unifying results in the sense of a larger group of Californians really seeing the value of immigrants, especially from an economic lens. A large group of Californians understanding that we have to come together when it comes to solutions about the children at the border and how we treat them humanely. So those were some of the areas that, once again, I wouldn't say shocking, but I was very happy to see.
Jessica, in fairness, we should let either Michael or Charlie weigh in on this also if they would like to.
Okay, I'm not sure this is most shocking, but I was surprised that because we understand that Asian Americans are fearful of their safety. So when school fully open in person, I figured that Asian parents would be really concerned about school bullying and harassment at school about their children. And then sure enough, 72% of Asian Americans are really reluctant, really uncomfortable about sending the kids, about worry about the kids being bullied. And to my surprise, African Americans and Latinos are not too far behind. They also worry about their children being bullied because of racism. And that's why, as much as we understand the deficiency of remote learning, and minority groups in general are very lukewarm about fully participating in in-person school learning. And then when you have 40% feeling very uncomfortable sending the kids back to school in person because of racism, this is across all ethnic groups, in minority groups. And that's a serious problem. How do kids learn when the parents fear about their being harassed and they have to live under that kind of family environment? And I think that the educator really need to deal with this. And bullying has always been a problem, but I didn't know how widespread it has become.
Michael, do you have something beyond that you noticed other than what Helen and Charlie raised?
I think they raised two of the most important issues that came out of the polling, and it is of what you heard from both of them is a function of the resegregation that we have in this country, in our state, in our county, and in our city. And the only way to address these issues is to have more interaction between one another. There's no substitute for that. There's no substitute for that.
Well, and Jessica, don't kill me, but if I can offer a moderator's point of privilege here, I'll notice that no one, including myself, is willing to admit being shocked. So I won't offer something to the questioner about being surprised, but rather something that I found very meaningful and very hopeful. Is on one hand, our respondents were still fairly negative about race relations and the level of discrimination at the federal level on a nationwide basis. Here in the state of California, they were much more optimistic about what they saw as progress being made. But where our respondents in the Latino, in the Asian Pacific, and the African American and the white communities across the board, where our respondents were most optimistic about forward progress was in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities. And given the points that Helen and Charlie and Michael have been making about the importance of cross-community conversation, the fact that so many Californians of all racial and ethnic heritages did see marked progress in their own neighborhoods, and were most optimistic about further progress in their own communities, might not have been shocking to me, but was certainly very heartening.
Can you talk about the vaccine hesitancy in some minority communities? There has been a history of vaccines being misused against Africans and African Americans, for example, the Tuskegee experiment.
Michael?
More than happy to address this. For those of you who don't know, the Tuskegee experiment was an experiment on Black males that carried on for some 40 years, where where the medical profession pretended to give these Black men who were suffering from syphilis a drug that would help them, and they were given a placebo, not knowing that. And it wasn't until the 1970s that it was exposed. This was an outrageous act on the part of the medical community. it colors the relationship between the African American community and the medical community to this day. But that is not the only thing. The fact is that you look at infant and maternal mortality in the Black community, it is literally 4 times higher than any other ethnic group. It is born of a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the African American community. I have been told that doctors believe that Black women don't feel pain the way white women feel. It is outrageous, the types of the attention that is given to Black patients as opposed to white patients. So that's overall, and it is so it's more than the Tuskegee experiment that feeds the mistrust. And it is there and it is real, and it has to be overcome. We, the Los Angeles Urban League, we co-sponsored some vaccination drive at the Crenshaw Shopping Center, and we were able to vaccinate over 15,000 people. People would come in and say, because the Urban League's name is on it, we are comfortable with this. There is a mistrust with the medical community that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed quickly on a lot of different fronts. It is not simply people saying, "Oh, you know," there's a lot of stuff on the internet again that talks about things that are far-fetched, but there is a mistrust between the Black community and the medical community that needs to be addressed on a larger scale. We are working with doctors and nurses and a lot of other organizations to address this, but it is long-term coming, and it will not happen, will not be corrected overnight. But yes, there was a reluctance. The reluctance is born in experience, but we are doing what we can to change that mindset, and a lot of people are getting vaccinated now.
Great, thank you. This will probably be our final question since this hour flew by. You all work on the ground in community groups, but I'm wondering what state or federal policies you think are most necessary to systemically combat racism. Can any federal policies actually help things, or will it take grassroots organizing on the ground in communities to make meaningful progress?
I'm going to ask each of the three of you to take a unfairly quick shot at that very important question. Helen, did you want to lead off?
Happy to. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. You have to have the laws in place to hold people accountable, to hold leadership accountable, to hold community accountable, and we know that. You don't see the drastic change that we need to when it comes to race relations and ensuring equal opportunity across the board without strong laws, both at the state, the local, and the national level. So that's critically important. But if you don't have community engagement, if you don't have community accountability, individuals ensuring that those laws are being implemented correctly, I'll take, it's not so much a law, but I'll take one thing, the stimulus package. The first round did not reach our minority communities and in the way that they could have to make an impact to ensure a good recovery from COVID-19. The rounds since then have had the needed input from community to help with that outreach, to ensure that our communities were being targeted, but also that the budget of the stimulus was addressing how our communities' businesses run. So it's an all of the above option, and community activism and the groundwork that we all do is instrumental to ensure that not only are the laws implemented, but that they're shaped and designed by the individuals that we can all take advantage of and learn from and leverage in our community.
Jessica, I'm guessing that Helen's overview is going to need to speak for all the rest of us too, given the timing.
We have more time if you have more time, so we can go a little bit longer if you'd like.
Charlie, did you want to weigh in as well, please?
Yes, let me quick, we did pass an anti-Asian hate crime bill, and I think, that is a deterrent, and that applies only after a crime has been committed. So, but you cannot legislate bigotry. You cannot legislate ignorance. I think in order to do that, we need to teach history, a more broader-based history about of this country and how different immigrant groups, how different ethnic groups come together and build this country. And in addition to that, I think community groups really need to understand each other. I think this poll opened the eyes of Asian Americans, at least how how racism impact not just us, but everybody else. And it is this concept about we're in the same boat, we need to stand together. It's going to be the ultimate solution.
Michael, did you like to?
I can't say it any more eloquently than Charlie and Helen did. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. This country was born with a racist mantra that we have been fighting for 400 years, and there's still much work to be done. But with the help of the people who are on this panel, with the help of the people who are listening, we have made progress and we will continue to do so.
Great. Well, Helen, Charlie, Michael, thank you so much for your eloquence and your work in this very important area. And Dan, thank you again for your support of these organizations and for helping to bring them to the council. And to our audience, I'll turn it back over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And thanks once again to all of you for joining us today. Before we bring Kim back on to wrap things up, I'm just going to make one last point off of something that Michael said a little bit earlier in the program. He said, it's not as, I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially said it's not as if one of us can change the world. And that's exactly right. But he reminded me of a famous quote from the late Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computers. Mm-hmm. And Steve Jobs, in his famous commencement address at Stanford University before his death, he talked about the importance of putting a dent in the universe. And I love that quote. And what I love about it is it suggests that while changing the world is pretty difficult, the world's a really big place. But if each one of us picks up a crowbar and finds one single place to swing it and make a dent, you add up all those dents in the universe. And the ultimate outcome is that you've changed the world. And the really wonderful thing about Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment, for the LA Urban League, for Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, and so many other organizations like them around the Southland, around the state, and around the country, is each one of them does a terrific job of handing out crowbars and helping us understand how to make a dent in the universe. So Kim, if you'll be willing to rejoin us to wrap things up, but I just want to thank my friends Charlie and Helen and Michael, not just for being here with us today, but all the amazing work they do all day, every day, on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, Dan. This was such an extraordinarily important discussion, and I'm so appreciative of your time and your expertise of this panel. And Dan, thank you again for moderating. We have to have you back, and this should be an ongoing discussion. So thank you so much.